Hi, my name is Sandy Saunders. My topic is teens and young adults with ADHD and self-medication. I selected this topic because my experience with friends in clinicals, I have seen lots of these people self-medicating through either smoking, alcohol, and other illicit drugs. And I've always wanted to know if there's a reason for it and why do they self-medicate? Are there specific reasons? Are there underlying reasons? Is it misdiagnosis? Are students with ADHD more likely to self-medicate than students without it? And how can I or we help as teachers to help these students, or how can professionals help them? For my first journal, it came from the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. Some of the key info was the study in this article investigated the relationship between ADHD symptoms and cigarette smoking, alcohol use, and illicit drug use. The participants completed questions relating to anxiety, depression, ADHD symptoms, smoking, alcohol consumption, and drug use. Some of the findings I had found from this journal were that smoking, alcohol, and illicit drug use were significantly related to ADHD symptoms. Another finding that I had found was that alcohol and cannabis were the most frequently abused substances in people with ADHD. Also, childhood ADHD is associated with nicotine use in adolescence and alcohol and drug disorders in adulthood. And as you can see in this table 2, this is showing the differences between ADHD with symptomatic and non-symptomatic groups in reports of the use of these 9 illicit drugs. As you can see, in the symptomatic group, sedatives, hashish, marijuana, and amphetamines were the top 4 competitors with substance abuse. The sedatives is basically, this study was done in Iceland, and the article mentions that this just might just be their culture, even though the article had mentioned that overall alcohol and cannabis are the most frequently abused substances in people with ADHD. Another finding that I found that people with ADHD have mood instability, which is commonly related, and this may be an important mediating factor as to why these persons are self-medicating. All of these symptoms may encourage young persons with ADHD to self-medicate by the use of various substances to help regulate mood and feelings of restlessness and to help them sleep. In the second chart, I'm about to show. This is a chart, as you can see, it shows the relationship between ADHD symptoms and multiple categories of substance use: smoking, drinking, and illegal drugs. The 3 substances being smoking, drinking, and illegal drugs, the 2 being smoking, drinking, and the 1 being smoking. As you can see, in this study, one of the findings was also that more girls were more prone to use these drugs more frequently. For total ADHD symptoms, the effects were substantially larger among the girls and the boys that the journal discussed. Another finding that I found from this journal was that there's a preference for cannabis among ADHD participants, and this is consistently reported throughout. Going on to journal number 2. This journal was from an online article, Alcohol and Alcoholism, and this article was basically done to see if there's a nicotine and alcohol dependence in patients with ADHD. Some of the findings and key information that I found from this article was that large number of ADHD patients suffer from alcohol dependence and even greater number from nicotine dependence. And this relates to journal number 1 in that they also, in journal number 1, had a very large alcohol and nicotine dependence. Some of the findings found from this article are that there's a greater likelihood of adolescents with ADHD developing an addiction to cigarettes compared to adolescents without ADHD. And this I mentioned in journal number 1, that there's such a high frequency of young adolescents being addicted to cigarettes. Another observation finding that I found was that this article revealed that ADHD patients with nicotine addiction often demonstrate an improvement of attention, concentration ability, and control of impulses. One of the more intriguing possibilities is that nicotine released when smoking cigarettes remediates or partially relieves the symptoms of ADHD, including the inattention and impulsivity. So this is a reason to maybe as why these persons with ADHD are smoking cigarettes, because it uh, relieves these ADHD symptoms, which are inattention and impulsivity, for that amount of time. One other finding that I found from this journal number 2 is that there's a high prevalence of nicotine dependence in ADHD patients, and that could be explained pathophysiologically, and that nicotine stimulates the release of neurotransmitters and in this way increases the attention span. So there again, that could be another reason as to why cigarette smoking has such a high prevalence in persons with ADHD. Clinical observations have provided evidence that nicotine significantly reduces ADHD symptoms and therefore has been discussed as a possible form of a therapeutic agent. So with saying that when I talk about nicotine use being so high, those are just some of the reasons as to why these persons with ADHD are smoking cigarettes, is because it's known as a therapeutic agent and can relieve these symptoms of ADHD. For journal number 3, this was from the Brown University Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology Update. This article had ADHD a risk factor for substance abuse. They basically concentrated as that topic. One finding that I found from this article that was very different from journal number 1 is that they found no significant difference between boys and girls with that of like drug use. They found it the same, and they even said that was a striking finding. Another finding that I found that the researchers hypothesized that ADHD would be a risk factor for substance use disorders, and that persistent ADHD and conduct disorders and academic and cognitive dysfunction in youths with ADHD would predict later substance use problems. So basically, as I'm going to mention, that this will have later problems, and in one of my articles I'm going to be talking about, it mentions that cigarette smoking is this gateway drug for more illicit drug use. The three main, which relates to article journal 1 and 2, the three main drugs were that of smoking, alcohol, and marijuana or cannabis. So this is very prevalent in all three journals so far, that those three drugs are very high up there with the use of persons with ADHD. In journal number 4, this is a very different journal. This is from the Vision and Optometry journal. And, Optometry and Vision Development journal. And I'm not going to get into as to why they decided to write about it. They kind of talk about ADHD in the beginning, and that's what I used for my research. At the end, they get into this vision, and it shies away from my actual research project. But the main point of this article is that it's about Steve Howie, who was a pitcher for the 1990 Yankees, and he had a cocaine addiction. He was 48, and he was suspended from baseball 7 times because of this substance abuse, and in 1992 was suspended for life. The Union General Counselor, named Richard Moss, said he was misdiagnosed. Howie was sent to programs that had nothing to do with his disease. Howie had ADHD, and that caused his addictions. So basically, this article is talking about people self-medicating themselves with cocaine and them being addicted because it takes away that feeling of low frustration and temper and that stress and that anxiety. And so that is why they prefer stimulants like cocaine, which, as you can see, this is very different from journals 1, 2, and 3. Cocaine was never mentioned, and if it was a very small percent. This could be the fact that this article is from the 1990s and times have changed, and with Journal 1, 2, and 3 being more recent, that could be an implication. Um, but it just that, like, this just goes along with the self-medicating. This article talks about the self-medication hypothesis, and this is why these people are going to these drugs, because it temporarily takes them away from those ADHD symptoms. Going on to journal number 5, this was one of my very brief articles. I used it basically to see why these persons with ADHD, like, what's their motivation for using these drugs. Some of the motivation for using these drugs, and I'm sorry, this was from the American Journal on Addictions. The motivation for use is to aid sleep, to get high. Some are unknown, but a lot of it has to do with the self-medication. And the reason why they say it is because self-medication was from the participants' responses. Some were stress, pain, medical, numbing, and addictive. So that is why it was known as self-medicating. Something that was different from journal number 1 is that the majority of subjects preferred alcohol, which in journal 1 it was cannabis and cigarettes. Alcohol was still up there, it was. And that is what I found from journal number 5. Overall, I talked about some differences, the similarities across all of them, similarities and differences between a few journals. But the main reason why I wanted to do this research is just, to find out more about why students with ADHD are self-medicating. These journals have answered some of my questions, and even in journals, I think in number 1, to talk about future educators, it says, there is need for early intervention in this vulnerable group who may be attempting to self-medicate. And in journal number 3, Boston University talks about that professionals need to initiate conversations about substance abuse with patients and their families early on. He says, we can predict that a child will be at risk by the 5th grade, so we should be talking about it in the 5th grade. This is very important. We need to see it as soon as possible, and we need to talk about it. We need to confront it. We need to make sure there's no misdiagnosis, and we need to get under the real meaning as to why they are self-medicating, or why they would even start. The Boston University Journal number 3 even states, the study's lead author recommends close monitoring of ADHD use with conduct disorder, as well as early discussions of substance use in the grade school population with ADHD. So my job as a teacher is just to make sure, I'm seeing this as soon as I can, and if I'm not able to talk about it, that I go to a professional that can, and make sure that it is brought up, and that we could stop this self-medicating process and get them the real help. So the cigarette smoking, which in some journals was calling the gateway drug, doesn't lead to the hard, alcoholism. It doesn't lead to marijuana use, sedatives, cocaine, other things like that. So seeing it early on would be better. And as this picture shows, ADHD and addiction, understanding, accepting, and healing, we need to help these students. And even adults still need help today. This ends my research project. Thank you.